You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, in this particular presentation, we're going to take a look at colonial society and attempt to appreciate the culture of England and the English attitudes towards native peoples. When we take a look at early colonial strategists, they dreamed of a society where the native population would assimilate the culture of England and eventually be incorporated into white society, thereby, according to them, enjoying the benefits of civilization. But the 17th century indigenous experiences reveals that the British were not committed to this vision. In the Chesapeake, the century reveals an overwhelming racism that was tied to land hunger. In fact, John Eliot preached in New England about converting the heathens to Christianity. A small number were, and those that did were not integrated into society, but they were segregated and isolated. And as the first page of the PowerPoint reveals, go ahead and go to the PowerPoint, we will see that those that lost out on the wars of expansion and aggression became vulnerable. They were outnumbered, and they became identified as the praying Indians. These were communities that were located outside the town's boundaries. They were created, the first ghettos or the first barrios, or the first segregated neighborhoods of poverty. Now, when it comes to economics, native peoples became an important element in British marketing strategies. Trade, exchange, and cooperation became important for merchants, not war and hostilities. And in the north, there were the Dutch, the French, and New England colonies where they were negotiating with various groups for the lucrative fur trade, especially in beaver pelts. So I provide for you in this map so that you can understand the different foreign powers in the early period of colonization, where the yellow represents the Spanish, the green areas here and up here represent the British, this orange area here represents the Dutch, this blue area here represents the Swedish, and the purple area represents the French. So we have the Spanish, the French, the Swiss, the Dutch, and the British all competing for native trade. Now, in the South, the Spanish and the British traded for deerskin, and for a few decades, native slaves. Now, in exchange, native peoples received manufactured goods, iron products, and alcohol. Now, the effects of this trade shifted the balance of power amongst native nations. So it was known as competitive advantage. Competitive advantage was introduced amongst the interior groups in the North and the South, especially in the case of firearms, which gave certain groups a technological advantage over others. So there were Hurons and Crees and Iroquois up in the North, all vied for power as the British, the Dutch, and the French entered into cooperative ventures for the trade in furs. And this, in this particular region, up in this area here, native peoples became dependent on whites, just as whites became dependent on native peoples. Now, the competition for trade stepped up the conflict already existing between different native nations. And the increased dependency on European goods influenced native peoples to change their ways of life. It affected their economic and political structures, making it more male-centered rather than matrilineal, especially due to war. Now, women did the agricultural work, hence they were the possessors of territory, which conveyed to them political influence. This would change as Europeans took over more and more land. Now, those groups along the coast, and these groups along this coastline here, they are going to be experiencing the first 100 years of contact, and they'll be eventually forced to establish the notion of private property and hence a reorganization of their social structure. Also, along the coastline, disease played a significant factor in the native communities' attempts to resist European occupation. Now, the early expeditions that were responsible for wiping out huge numbers of people, especially along the coast, had tremendous impact on the native peoples, and it allowed colonies to expand westward. As they expanded westward, successive disasters advanced with them. So native religious thought incorporated visions, dreams, and direct supernatural intervention. The English would interpret this as possession by the devil, just like the way Puritans persecuted witches. The British, once securing structured boundaries and eliminating larger native resistance efforts, denied the right to land by natives if it was not occupied. And this was drawn from their agrarian background. If you cultivate, you occupy. Now, of course, following biblical guidance, Christian nations have a right to take lands from non-Christians. So this religious concept encouraged racial bigotry and discouraged missionary work. So this struggle for land led to wars, and wars reinforced racial hostility. It was a vicious cycle that is still playing itself out to this day. So when we look at the coastal societies, their experiences with colonization was tremendous. Native peoples had to develop or create many ways to deal with the onslaught. And these processes of change are identified as resistance, withdrawal, accommodation, and assimilation. So throughout the 17th century and well into the 18th century, these societies fought for their rights at every stage of development. Native peoples did not know peace for the first 125 years of British expansion. Wars were fought to assert their power and to prevent further intrusions into their linguistic traditions. Now, in New England, various groups are going to keep the British at bay through skirmishes that lasted 60 years. So let's take a look at the different kinds of skirmishes that will be explained in the textbook. In New England, various Algonquian-speaking groups kept the British at bay through skirmishes that lasted 60 years. 1620 to 1680, the most famous wars in New England were what was known as the Pequot War of 1637 and Metacom's War, or King Philip's War, of 1675 and 1677. Now, I'm going to have you watch a particular a video clip that I will eventually show after this particular presentation. So I'm going to ask you to please watch what happened in the Pequot War and Metacom's War. And again, the textbook explains that. Now, the Pequot War was vicious, and the devil or Satan came out to play. The white population reacted harshly to native resistance to land occupation, and their fear of the other, their increasing land hunger, and their racial animosity were factors that led them to take the Pequot and Wampanoags by surprise and force them into negotiations where those who were captured were enslaved and then eventually were segregated into communities identified as praying Indians. Now, in Metacom's War, or what is known as King Philip's War, this was the Wampanoags' last attempt to keep what they had remaining in their ownership. Puritan land hunger and racial hatred influenced Metacom and the Wampanoags to form alliances with other groups, and they maintained a protracted war along the coast. In fact, as we will see, the Virginians are going to hear about this war, and they will use it as a reason for attacking the Susquehannocks in Bacon's Rebellion. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and watch a particular film on Metacom's War, King Philip's War, and I'll pause for about 5 seconds here so that you can go and watch that film clip, and then we'll come back and we'll deal with the Chesapeake. Okay, so now you have returned from watching that film, and so you can understand one of the things about Puritan land hunger and the racial hatred, how Metacom and the Wampanoags tried to form alliances. And again, the Virginians are going to be hearing about this war, and they're going to use it as a reason for attacking the Susquehannocks in Bacon's Rebellion. Now let's go to the Chesapeake, and we'll go back to the outline, the PowerPoint, and we'll take a look at the Chesapeake. And between 1608 and 1680, Native peoples incorporated as what is known as the Powhatan Confederacy. They were primarily responding to British aggression and expansion in the Chesapeake. Now, the Confederacy consisted of, the Powhatan Confederacy consisted of 28 different linguistic traditions in one language family, in one union. They were creating a nation. This is what is known as Pocahontas' people. Now, Powhatan was the hereditary specialist. Now, his younger brother in 1622, his name is Opechancanough, is going to lead a military expedition against the Virginians. Now, Opechancanough in 1619 is going to go to Jamestown and warn them that they were disrespecting their most sacred plant, which was tobacco. Tobacco was used for religious ceremonies, but tobacco was a cash crop that Virginians were using to expand their colonial society. And basically what happened was the Confederacy, now under Opechancanough, created a Renaissance movement. There was a cultural and religious revitalization movement against the dreaded tobacco production and the disease that came with that. Now, Opechancanough, in a war, is going to wipe out 1/3 of the white population. The colonial leaders will respond to this intrusion with an extermination campaign that will continue throughout the decade. This is where the Hollywood phrase, eliminate with prejudice, comes from. Of course, Disneyland's Pocahontas cartoon never tells you about this extermination program. One of the things of John Smith, what he said about Pocahontas' people on his policy of extermination, and these are his words: "They are by nature slothful and idle, vicious, melancholy, slovenly of bad conditions, less capable of 6 or 7 years old, and less apt and ingenious." So what's going to happen is Opechancanough, by 1644, the peoples of the Confederacy are going to rise up against the Virginians in a concerted effort. They resisted assimilation, accommodation, and adaptation models of the Virginians. And so after 20 years of occupation, Opechancanough had enough. Now, this time, he's going to make a deal with Maryland white settlers who were Catholics that kind of had conflicts with the Virginians who were Puritan or Protestants. The Catholics were supposed to deliver firearms to Opechancanough, but when the resistance movement unfolded, the Maryland Catholics never showed up with the arms. But that did not bother Opechancanough and the resistance. They preferred death rather than submit to a life of servitude and misery. And by 1669, only 11 of the 28 linguistic traditions survived, and only about 2,000 of the 20,000 John Smith saw when he first encountered Pocahontas' people were alive. And then 7 years later, between 1675 and 1678, Bacon's rebellion would slaughter the Susquehannocks, with the Susquehannocks going on an all-out revenge to the death. Now, this you'll be able to read in the textbook, but what I want to share with you with regards to Opechancanough and the resistance, for 20 years the British are going to go after Native peoples. And the concept of Redskins is going to appear in Virginia first. And the idea, of course, is that rewards were given for the slaughter of Native peoples. And these rewards, all you had to do was take in what were known as top knots. Now, this is what is known as a top knot, your scalp. And so a white settler, colonial settler, could go in. They were mercenaries, really, and that the government would use as colonial settler mercenaries, as is going to be explained in the textbook. And what you could do is, when you killed a Native person, in order to cash in on that kill, was that you took their top knots. And what a top knot meant was that you could either carve around the hairline here and then pull the hair, all right, and put it in a bag and then go and send it, and then take it into an agency so that you could get paid for killing Native Americans. And or you could just cut around the neck and then just pull the skin off, and then you'd have it and put it in a knapsack, and then go and get your reward for killing a Native person. And of course, because the knapsacks and it was bloody, when you went to cash in, you submitted your red skins. And so this is where the term Redskins comes from. It comes from the genocidal slaughter of Native peoples. So please understand that, especially for those of you who like the Washington Redskins, recognize that what that mascot means is the genocidal slaughter of native peoples by colonial settler mercenaries. So understand the Redskins term. Now, Bacon's rebellion, as you will see, between 1675 and 1678, basically these were small landholders who were frustrated that the elite landholders had made a treaty with the Susquehannocks because the Susquehannocks were more powerful after Opechancanough had resisted in the Powhatan Confederacy. There was a group that lived along what was known as the Piedmont, rather than the Tidewater regions. And the Susquehannocks were more a formidable force. And one of the things with the colonial settlers, they wanted to expand their land base, and they didn't like the fact that the elite settlers had made a treaty with the Susquehannocks because they were frustrated, saying, well, where is our American dream? Why should Native peoples have rights over us? And so given the frustrations of the small landholders, and as well as indentured servants of not being able to get land so they could realize their American dream, you hear the story of how Bacon's rebellion was a rebellion of the lower classes against the upper classes. But one of the things that's most important is that they used native peoples as the scapegoat. So one of the things that Bacon did was organize landless peoples and small farmers to go into the forbidden area of the treaty lines and move into Susquehannock territory. And they started a war. Basically, the way that they started the war was they waited for the males to leave the villages, and then they went in and they murdered and slaughtered women, children, and elders. And so when the males came back, they were frustrated, and this led to an all-out war. The elites didn't like Bacon and that rebellion, and so the elites had to go and organize to put the Susquehannocks down in their resistance. And meanwhile, Bacon is going to go back into the House of Burgesses and burn it down because of their frustrations with the political elite. So the elite were going to be able to use, again, the native peoples as a tool by which to alleviate the plight of the poor. Sound familiar? How, again, poor whites get frustrated that perhaps native peoples have rights. And so this was known as the Bacon's Rebellion in 1675 and 1678. So this will be the end of the first presentation of Native resistance to the colonial period.
You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.